when you've established that, taking the next step then to think about, okay, now that folks are in the space, how do we ensure that participants will feel safe and seen in the ways that they need? And I think that's a really great conversation to just have with your team, and also have maybe opportunities to get feedback from clients or participants within our programs and services as well. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our very first podcast episode for the Gender Inclusion Committee. My name is Kristen. I go by they, them, and she, her pronouns. I am one of the co-chairs of the Gender Inclusion Committee, and I do identify as queer, so really excited to share a little bit more today with you about our topic. I'll pass it over to my co-podcaster, Casey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Casey. My pronouns are he, they. And I am the other co-chair of the Gender Inclusion Committee. Um, I am a two-spirit indigiqueer individual, so I'm very excited to be able to do this work alongside Kristen and to share a little bit of things that we've learned with you folks.
Yeah, yeah, and for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the committee, we work across the YWCA to identify opportunities, initiatives, and changes that strive to provide justice, equity, inclusion, and safety to people that experience marginalization on the basis of gender, sex, and sexual orientation. So I know that's a lot, but some, tangible things that maybe you've experienced as you've attended one of our trainings or discussions around some topics related to this, or maybe you've been to the program center and seen our lovely washroom that we have advocated for. Those are just two examples of some things that have come up as a result of this committee. And now you get to be involved in our most recent thing, which is this podcast. So yeah, to introduce our topic, Casey, do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. But before we get into our topic for today, it's important to recognize that we're recording this on the unceded, stolen, and settler-occupied homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're conscious of the rightful sovereignty and stewardship of these nations and all Indigenous nations of Turtle Island and around the globe. It's important that we take the time to genuinely reflect upon how the institutions that we're a part of are involved in the colonial project at large. And it's also important that we work together to intentionally change the system by uniting in our shared outrage and responsibilities rather than sitting in feelings of guilt and shame, because that can stop us from taking the actions that we need to be taking. So we invite you to be mindful of the space you exist upon, to tread lightly, be gracious, listen to Indigenous communities, and engage in an ongoing journey of learning. So, with this invitation to make things better and to live your life, aiming to do right and being intentional, action is necessary. And working to create anti-oppressive spaces is inherently vulnerable work, and we recognize that. Today, we're going to be talking about gender inclusivity in the workplace specifically. And if this is a new topic to you, we'd like to encourage listening and engaging with this topic as openly as you feel comfortable to do. Take risks, be vulnerable, and it's okay if you don't know everything. It's important to take appropriate, meaningful action to further your learning on this topic. So keep that in mind, because doing so is only going to help in the creation of a more inclusive workspace for you, for your colleagues, for program participants, and everyone else who's impacted by the work you do.
Thanks, Casey. Maybe the first thing that we can just start with is why is this topic important? And I wanted to just firstly share, this is about people being able to show up to work as their authentic self. And oftentimes we don't realize how much energy maybe we put into when we can't do that, especially if maybe it's something you've never experienced before. So yeah, part of this is just hopefully providing more information so people can show up and do the best work possible. But really, the second thing that I wanted to mention that people don't often consider is that this is the law. It's actually a legal right that employees have to show up and feel safe at work. So, specifically, we're talking about the terms gender identity and gender expression. And these were added to the Canadian Human Rights Act on list of identifiable groups protected from discrimination in the criminal code under sections targeting the inciting hatred, hate speech, and hate crimes against identifiable groups. So, what that really means is that all human resources practitioners and managers are responsible for providing a welcoming, inclusive, and respectful work environment for 2S LGBTQIA plus employees, clients, and program participants. So, if you kind of think of our YWCA community, that's really the group that we're trying to create this for. So some examples of what this can look like, it might just be making sure that transgender folk have access to a washroom that aligns with their self-determined gender identity. It might be also just making sure that everyone is referred to by the correct pronouns, the correct name, as well as maybe addressing instances, if this comes up of intentional misgendering in a really timely and effective manner. So just correcting mistakes, whether you're a manager or just a colleague. So that's a little bit about what it looks like more from the manager and human resources perspective. But Casey, do you want to speak to maybe just what it looks like more from an employee side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as an employee, you have the right to live in your gender identity without limits or exceptions, regardless of assigned sex at birth. Which brings us to an important differentiation to make, which is that of sex and gender. So, when we're talking about sex, this has to do with biological characteristics people are assigned at birth, such as sex chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive systems. This is not to be confused with gender, which encompasses the socially constructed roles associated with masculinity and femininity. And I'll be touching a little bit more on what socially constructed gender roles means a bit later on. But really, the point of this is we all have a gender identity, whether that sense of being falls in line with being perceived as male, female, or anywhere else on the gender spectrum. As an employee, you're allowed to express yourself through things such as your name, pronouns, your chosen style of dress and hairstyle, just how you want to show up in a way that is authentic to you and aligns with your gender identity.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And I feel like one thing I just want to kind of caveat with this is privacy is still important in these situations as well. So I know sometimes people are like, oh, maybe I see my colleague who's dressing different. Maybe they're more feminine or masculine or androgynous or whatever it is. And people might want to ask, oh, like, are you changing your gender or your gender identity? But I just like to remind folks that that's a very intrusive question. And just keep in mind, just because someone, yeah, like you might have a certain perception based off of their gender expression, it's never appropriate to ask those questions. And really, all employees have not just the legal part's really important, but really to create the most safe environment. It's important for people to be respectful of others' privacy. So I just like to keep that in mind. And it's not just about gender, but also, asking about people maybe if they have a legal name, like really don't ask about that, or not asking about people's sexual orientation. So any kind of information that you don't need to know in order to work together would be considered private.
Absolutely. And it's the job of the employer to create a space that feels safe. So, for gender diverse folks, there's a number of invisible barriers that can be in the way of feeling supported in the work environment. And it might be a little bit harder to be aware of these things if you yourself don't have the lived experience of coming across them in the workspace. For example, many folks do not stop to think about which washroom they're going to use. But for a trans or non-binary person, this could be a source of anxiety. Are the washrooms labeled as trans friendly? Is there a washroom available for folks who don't identify as male or female, or who feel like they may be at a place in their transition where they don't feel comfortable using a specifically gendered bathroom? Um, as gender is a spectrum, there are countless ways folks can relate to their experience of gender. Non-binary folks, for instance, can exist outside of the often assumed gender binary and might feel uncomfortable using a washroom assigned male or female. So we can ask ourselves, is an all-gender washroom available for staff and clients? And if there are changing rooms in a space, is an all gender changing room available as well? And then this can go to other topics like forms that folks have to fill out. Are people going to be expected to check whether they identify as male or female? Are those boxes even necessary? Um, or are there other options possible to select for gender diverse individuals? These are just some things that we can keep in mind that might not be at the forefront of your minds, but could be really important and to other folks and might impact their day.
Yeah, those are some really good questions, I think, to just think through and ask. Especially when you might not have that lived experience. It can help just to really look at what you're doing and create an accessible and inclusive space for folks of all gender identities. Something too, I just wanted to mention that's maybe a little bit more YWCA specific is I feel like internally a lot of us know kind of maybe more of the clients that we serve or how we set up the space, but I always like to remind people that due to the long history of the organization, people might see the YWCA as only serving cis women. So it's also really important for us to consider maybe how we advertise our programs and some things that we can consider is even just listing those whose gender identities align within the program. So if we are going to say a program is specifically for women, maybe we say cis and trans women, just so it's really explicit for people to know. Some other things that people might consider is even just like how do you visually maybe show that you are supportive or a person that people can go to. So, for example, like we have at the program center a little pride flag decal and a territorial acknowledgement on the front of our building, just as I think it's a nice signal to be like, hey, like this is our value. Here's what's important to us. Here's who's welcome here. And thinking of ways even maybe in your program or space you can have those. So I know, for example, I go out to schools a lot, which I don't always have control over what the space looks like, but I do wear a lanyard, and on that lanyard I have my pronouns and I have like a little pride button. And so it can be just a way to signal to folks that you're maybe that safe person. So when you've established that, taking the next step then to think about, okay, now that folks are in the space, how do we ensure that participants will feel safe and seen in the ways that they need? And I think that's a really great conversation to just have with your team, and also have maybe opportunities to get feedback from clients or participants within our programs and services as well.
Yeah, it can never hurt to show that you are a safe space and to make it as open and accessible for everyone by like having those visuals and being super explicit. Thank you, Kristen. Those
Mhm.
are really good things to keep in mind as we think through these topics together. Um, and Kristen, I'm wondering who exactly is impacted by the gender binary?
I love this question because I think, like you were mentioning earlier, sometimes when we get into those social constructs of gender, it's might seem like only certain people are impacted, but really all of us are impacted in some way. And it could be either through having maybe a lot of privilege with your gender, or maybe you're recognizing some inequities, or maybe you're put into a specific role based off of your gender or given specific tasks. So, really, all of us have some sort of way that we are impacted. And I think this is a really nice area for some self-reflection. And I will say, in the toolkit, we do have, if you're like, I don't know where to start, we do have a little journaling component that you can look into and think a little bit more about how your gender, or your gender identity, or your gender expression is maybe impacted by societal expectations in the world. So, yeah, I would say everyone is really impacted.
Yeah, those are really great suggestions for how to think through this if you're not super sure how you're impacted by gender personally. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm. I think, Casey, one thing I maybe will ask you about, I know some people, they always are like, okay, well, do I need to know all of the terms in order to, be respectful or kind or to be a good ally? And so I was wondering, can you speak a little bit maybe to knowing all of the terminology and yeah, just any recommendations that you have on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really important to make an effort to understand more about these terms, for sure. But at the end of the day, language is always changing, and the best thing we can do is listen to people and their needs and do that research. Really, treating people with kindness and care is the most important thing. Learning is a journey, it happens over time. And, the toolkit is always available here in case there are words that are unfamiliar or if anyone needs a refresher on a topic. We've got a glossary, so you can scroll to the bottom of the toolkit and take a peek. But yeah, that's always present. And just like, you know, understanding these big topics like gender being a social construct, like it it can be a big thing to wrap your head around if you were not raised to like have this in your vocabulary and understand it. But just as an example, gender being a social construct means it was an idea created and constructed by people in society. So even in terms of like language, it's important to remember that like this idea of this binary gender was only a recent social construct. The ways in which we're describing it have only been recently made. Throughout history, we've seen many cultures recognize gender on a spectrum or have many different words to describe different gender identities or forms of expression. So even if you can't imagine such a reality, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and you don't need to relate to it personally for it to be valid. So if you don't get it, listen and learn from folks with the experience of being trans, non-binary, or two-spirit, gender diverse, and seek out resources on your own time to learn more. So it's really like the heart of the effort is what's more important than the terms, and like having that memorized understanding of the definition.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, and I think it really ties into a lot of maybe intersectional approaches to just equity and inclusion in general, where it's a lot about even thinking about, okay, my brain has been taught to think maybe this way or to perceive, okay, I have to categorize people as a specific gender, and sometimes it does just take time to start to reflect and maybe unlearn or untrain your
Mhm.
brain to think a certain way. And that's not going to be like, cool, I read this book and now I know like it just takes time.
It can be tricky. Yeah.
Totally. And so I think that's a really great perspective. And I love that you said just listening to people because I think that's such a good way is through storytelling is to just hear someone's story and maybe just really have the chance to address parts of maybe even days of your life that you don't really think about. Oh, I didn't consider this as maybe a challenge, or oh, I didn't know that this was something that people maybe are worried about, or I didn't realize this question maybe was something that was maybe intrusive. So I think it's a good just to continue to have those listenings to folks. That's a really good suggestion.
Yeah, for sure. And then on the day to day, outside of your own active learning, there's a few things you can start doing right away to make the spaces you're in as inclusive for gender diverse folks as possible. This can look like sharing your name and pronouns when you meet someone for the first time. Because when you look at someone, you can't assume, like, you can't tell what gender somebody is just by looking at them. And by sharing your pronouns first, it creates a space in which other folks can potentially feel safe enough to share those with you as well. Just by making that a part of your introduction, you're helping create a space for gender diverse folk to feel comfortable and share who they are with you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think it's so simple, just like when you meet someone, just being like, hi, I'm Kristen. Like, I use she, they pronouns. Welcome. Like, just
Yeah.
that little thing can make such a huge difference. And I know I get a lot of questions from folks just around, what do I do if I use the wrong pronouns? I would say don't stress too much about it. Just correct yourself in the moment. Like, if you are talking to someone, like if someone was talking to me and they were like, oh, yeah, Kristen, oh, they, like you could just say that and then continue to move on. I think sometimes putting all of the onus maybe on the person who you are misgendering to like forgive you can actually create more strain in your relationship. We make I like to remind people we make mistakes just in talking day to day. Like I'll say something, I'm like, wait, that's not what I meant. So I think just treating it as it's that type of situation and letting your intent show through. So, your intent was not to use the wrong pronouns. You just accidentally said that. So it's just, okay, my intent is to correct it and move on.
Yeah, you don't want to put that emotional labor on the person who has been misgendered, and don't want to make it into like a bigger deal than it needs to be. It's just less comfortable for everyone that way. So
For
that
sure.
definitely is the nicest way to go about it. And also, practice definitely helps. I know some folks who struggle to incorporate they them pronouns into dialogue when referring to folks. And it was only with practice that they improved. But yeah, making a mistake doesn't have to be this big thing. And it really shouldn't be. Excessive apologizing can make the person whose pronouns you used incorrectly feel uncomfortable. And then it also centers your guilt rather than their level of comfort. And like, it's all right to feel bad, of course, but moving past it after correcting your mistake is really the best way to go because it's not the responsibility of the person you misgendered to hold your feelings about having slipped up.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm really happy you mentioned practice. I know sometimes it can be hard to change our language, and I think that even brings into just even thinking about if you're giving a presentation or talking to a group, using really gender inclusive terms. Like, I know this sort of fact. Everyone always is like, "Hey guys," I totally get it. It's just a part of day to day. We hear it a lot, but maybe even challenging yourself if you're practicing, a presentation just to use more gender inclusive terms. Like, I love hey friends. I just always say that, or hi
Yeah.
folks, or how's everyone doing? There's a lot of really good ways that you can replace even some of those gendered terms that come up. And then also, I think that invites folks to also maybe share pronouns when you're not assuming that you are presenting or talking to a space that is of a binary kind of gender basis of male, female, or girl, boy, woman, man. It's more inclusive when you have those terms. Or another one that I will say too, if you ever use scenarios, maybe like include the pronouns in there when you're doing it. So maybe you have like Sam, and you have the they them example in your scenarios. So there's I think a lot of ways that you can include that just in your day to day and through small changes.
Absolutely. Truly, the number of times I've been, even in like a restaurant space, and the server comes up and is like, "Hi, ladies." And I'm like, "Oh, now I don't feel comfortable to like correct that, it's just better not to assume. And you can even make a list for yourself of like options of gender neutral ways to address groups. But ultimately keep practicing, keep engaging in this learning, even just by listening to this podcast. You are doing the work. So thank you so much for joining us. um, that brings us to the end of our first podcast episode with the Gender Inclusion Committee. So it's very exciting. We're looking
Yes.
forward to chatting soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And just a reminder to check out the toolkit if there's anything that you were interested in learning more about today. There's a lot more information and resources there. So thanks for joining us.